concert. Jessica Le Mesurier. Many thanks for that, Jessica Le Mesurier in the newsroom. Welcome. It's indeed time for the France 24 debate. $29 billion worth of gas revenue siphoned off over 10 years. This is a story that's out of Nigeria, according to a government commission report leaked to the Western media. There's billions worth of missing signing bonuses, an undervalued selling prices, all at a subsidiary of the national oil company, whose shareholders include Shell, Italy's Eni, France's Total. Nothing proves that they paid what Nigerians call dash, but the report denounces the opacity of the foreign company's partnership. Nigeria is just one nation among many where foreigners do often pay bribes to do business. In fact, look no further than France, says the OECD, which has just put out a report blasting what it calls Paris's, quote, lackluster track record on pursuing offenders. How bad is it really? And is it realistic to crack down on corporate bribes to foreign officials if, as it's often said, everyone else is doing it? Today in the France 24 debate, how to stop the rot when doing business abroad. And with us to talk about it, Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report. Welcome back, sir. Welcome as well to Frederick Davis, who is a corporate attorney here in Paris, who knows the law from both sides of the Atlantic. We'll be joined a little bit later on from the OECD by Patrick Moulette for part two of our discussion. Now, the France 24 debate, where you can always weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. You can find us at François F24. That leaked report we mentioned at the outset insists there is no proof of illegal activities on the part of foreign companies. But it does say the following, that the gas revenue losses accrued in dealings with Nigeria Liquid Natural Gas, NLNG, a company owned by the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, as well as Shell, Eni, and Total. The price at which feedstock gas was sold to the NLNG seems, quote, too generous compared to the prices obtainable on the international market. There's no comment, Patrick Smith, on the part of Shell, Eni, and Total. And, of course, it's conjecture, but there is a past track record in Nigeria. That missing $29 billion.
Well, that's right. I mean, on one level, this gas project in Nigeria offered a sort of a new opportunity, because Nigeria is actually more of a gas producer than an oil producer. So it came up with what was a very good plan to utilize all the gas produced in the process of drilling for oil and producing oil, and to liquefy it and then sell onto the world market. That's been, that plan was mooted, I think, 20 years ago. So they actually got it going in the middle of a military dictatorship led by Sani Abacha. And I think that was part of the problem, because it was a military dictatorship, all the processes around that gas plant were absolutely opaque and, as it's turned out, pretty terminally corrupt, to the extent that all the contractors involved in the procurement for that plant have now paid up to almost $2 billion in fines to the U.S. Justice Department. We may be asking why they're paying fines to the U.S. Justice Department when Nigeria was defrauded. Well, it goes back a long way, but to cut a long story short, it started in Paris when one of the middlemen involved in the deal was talking about a deal in Gabon and saying you haven't seen anything when you look at what went on in Nigeria for the LNG gas plant. That prompted a French investigation into the conduct of the French companies involved, which was an engineering company called Technip, and then the Elf Total Petroleum Company.
So hold on. So let's take this. So back in 2004, one guy says, "I'm not going down alone."
Right.
Look at Nigeria.
That's far worse.
So
he went off into a quiet room with the judge.
The story takes us from France, and then they go to Houston, I believe.
Yes, and then they said, the French company said, Technip and Elf and Total, they cut some corners, but what about Halliburton? They were the big players in all this, and they found out there was a British lawyer called Jeffrey Tesler sitting on $160 million in his Monaco account a decade after the contract was issued. And he was a middleman hired by Halliburton to do the negotiations. So then the American Department of Justice said, well, this seems to concern our companies actually far more than the French companies. And they took over the investigation. And then it went truly international. So what you've got is Halliburton have paid their fines.
Halliburton, the company that was partly owned by Dick Cheney.
Exactly. Dick Cheney was chief executive of Halliburton during the latter phases of the procurement contract. So there's some questions he's going to have to answer about this, presumably, as well.
We're pleased to be joined from Addis Ababa, where he's taking part in a conference by Lai Yahaya, who monitors oil and gas revenue for the Abuja-based group Transparent Aid. Thanks for joining us in the France 24 debate. I want to get back to what we were saying at the very top, Lai. $29 billion. A lot of people get lost when you see so many zeros. What does $29 billion represent for a country like Nigeria?
Well, actually, when you look at this figure that's usually used, it says that $400 billion has been lost or misspent since independence. $29 billion paid is significant. But moving away from kind of the amount of this, the content of what's been talked about, and again, this is a report.
Lai, I'm going to interrupt you because the phone line, the quality of the phone line is poor. We apologize for that. We're going to try to call you back and get a better line so that we can hear what you've got to say. There's another question in all of this, Patrick Smith. It says in the report as well, 250,000 barrels a day in Nigeria are stolen.
Yeah.
How do you make off with 250,000 barrels of oil and go unnoticed?
Well, that's a process they call in Nigeria illegal bunkering. And that involves everything from actually physically stealing the oil, that is, putting a separate pipe in the main pipeline and siphoning off the oil into a smaller ship. But actually the biggest loss of oil, and I've spoken to officials recently, and they're saying it could be 250,000, it could be more, is a sort of a white-collar crime. So X amount of oil is sent to X trader in The Hague or something like that, but instead it goes to a Russian trader. And the other ship is loaded, and the ship from The Hague comes in. Sorry, it's been your shipment's been diverted. You're going to have to wait for another one. And that is just taken off the books. And what this report shows is the intervention of a lot of these third-party independent oil traders in Nigeria. Most of the world's big oil producers, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Indonesia, and so on, send their oil directly to the refineries. In Nigeria, what they do is send it to a lot of third-party traders based in places like London and Geneva. And these guys are in league with corrupt officials in Nigeria's state oil company. And so they mark the price down that Nigeria is getting for the oil, and they mark the price up that they're selling it for. And they get a big margin. And that's at the root of this problem. And not only do they do that, they get this big margin. Sometimes they just move a shipment totally illegally to a different trader. And you'll find that a lot of those ships going to Russia and some of the Latin American oil traders, such as Venezuela and so on, are trading illegal Nigerian oil.
Frederick West, when you hear this story, and you see that Patrick Smith has mentioned, 4 continents so far in it. He hasn't gotten to Australia yet, but what's your reaction?
Well, corruption is not limited to one country or one continent. I mean, what you have is a situation where, particularly in developing countries, you have huge contracts in the billions of dollars that are let, and you often have a lack of transparency in the governmental systems. It's just an open invitation for people in power to put a price tag on giving out permissions that are necessary to procure a contract or to effectuate one. So it's a worldwide problem that I think to a certain degree the developed countries of the world are increasingly working together to try to fight.
Lai Yahaya, I believe we have the line back. I hope it's better this time. Apologies again for that. When you speak to people in Nigeria, are they just sort of taking it with a shrug? Are they angry at their own government? Are they angry at the foreign oil companies?
No, I mean, I think been, there have been a lot of allegations and rumors going around about sort of mass corruption, not just in the oil and gas sector, but clearly in the oil and gas sector. But what is different is that now there's a great deal more scrutiny and a great deal more transparency around what has been happening, just because there's more information now available on what's been happening. But secondly, also you have, just internationally, I mean, you have the recent amendment to the Dodd-Frank Act in the U.S. that basically now mandates, companies listed in the stock exchange to disclose, contract terms on a project-by-project basis. I know there's some European transparency laws going through. In a sense, a great deal of this has to do with to what extent, are the very companies that are involved in these countries willing to be more transparent. And I think, the changes are happening now such that they will be held more to account.
Patrick Smith, listening to what Lai just said, you and I are both Europeans. This is kind of bruising our egos. The conviction, he's talking about the Dodd-Frank Act, which is a piece of legislation in the United States. Why are the crusaders across the Atlantic, it seems, on this? You were mentioning yourself how surprising it is that the convictions, the investigation begins in France, but the big convictions come over in the U.S.
Well, the U.S. has, we've got to be honest about this, they've got a better track record on recognizing this problem and fighting it. You go back to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that was passed in 1977. The French Anti-Corruption Act was passed in 2000. The British Anti-Corruption Act was passed in 2009. They're playing catch-up all the time. What's quite interesting is the Dodd-Frank's laws that were passed last year, and now we've got the rules out for the implementation. The Europeans suddenly got the message, and they're trying to outlaw payments to, or rather require that European companies publish details of all their payments to governments. So they're still trying to play catch up to the Americans. But the Americans are definitely well ahead of the game, both in terms of legislation and prosecution. But one point is they're also ahead of the game with this idea of plea bargaining. So every corruption case then turns into a plea bargain, and the people who made the corrupt deals are never really personally held to account, but the company faces a big fine. So what seems to be happening is the big companies factor it into their operating costs. So Halliburton paid, the equivalent of $900 million in fines to the SEC and the Department of Justice for the gas procurement deal in Nigeria. Well, that's probably built into the inflated contract in the first place. So I think we still need to look beyond this and get beyond plea bargaining into a better system to really deter people from doing this.
I've heard French businessmen tell me when they go to China, they factor in just the way Patrick is mentioning it. Of course, they're not factoring in the fine, but they are factoring in the bribe when they go in. Are they really factoring in the fines now, the big corporations?
Probably. I think the real deterrent is the notion of a possibility of a jail term, and I think it's not entirely true that in the United States that companies simply, when they're caught, then work things out. A jail term of 15 years, 15 years in jail is recently imposed on a senior officer of a company under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Come on, give us a name. Who was it?
I frankly can't remember his name.
But I mean, but just on Stanley Halliburton was was number 3, and I think he got a 10-year jail term. It's true.
Right.
I think, but people were saying, as you said earlier, Mr. Cheney was the chairman of Halliburton when this happened, but he hasn't even faced questioning over it, and he won't answer questions. Which seems quite remarkable.
Well, it does or doesn't. I mean, you can't just indict somebody because he's head of a company. You have to be some link to something he knew about. To me, the important thing is that one country fighting against corruption is useless. I mean, I was a prosecutor in the United States when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was adopted in 1977. And if you look at the enforcement record, there were virtually no prosecutions brought for 20 years. And the reason is that if you have an American company competing against, for example, a French company, and they both pay a bribe, at that point, the American guy might go to jail, and the French company would get a tax deduction, and maybe a pat in the back if they beat the Americans, right? So the big turning point was the OECD treaty in the mid-90s, where now more or less, and to, I think, a heartwarming degree, there is a confluence among the approach of the developed countries, all 38 signatories to the convention, that we're not going to do corruption. And to the extent that all of the participants in a bid, for example, say, we're just not going to go there, then the country in question has no choice. the extent one of them or two of them say, let these other guys be nice guys, but we're going to grease someone's pocket, then they're simply getting the benefit of sort of easy competition. Where I think we are up against a limiting wall at this point is not the differences in the substantive law of what is corruption, or even is it a bad thing, as to which there's a fair degree of consensus, but rather what are the procedures for investigating it. And that, for a number of reasons, France on one hand and the United States on the other have completely different approaches, and the result of which it takes 7, 8 to 10 years in France for a juge d'instruction, for an investigating magistrate, to go through a complex investigation, including ones
But is that just the sign of an overburdened justice system, or is that deliberate?
No, it's a question of procedure, because in the United States and to a certain degree in the United Kingdom, although it's changing recently, the basic point that prosecutors make to companies is, look, if you discover that you paid a bribe someplace, come talk to us about it. We will work with you to find out everything that happened. Okay? And we will take it easy on your shareholders as long as you're honest with us and as long as we have the opportunity to go against the people who paid these bribes. That kind of negotiation for reasons of culture but also criminal procedure cannot happen in France. There's no opportunity to have that kind of discussion with a juge d'instruction.
Which brings us to the news of this week. France getting an earful from the OECD, a panel there. We'll hear about that in a minute. Reuters, though, I should say, called it already a rarity last month when aeronautics and defense firm Safran was convicted and fined 500,000 euros for paying bribes between 2000 and 2003 in order to get an ID-making bid with the Nigerian government. Apologies to our Nigerian viewers. It's not just Nigeria, by the way. Only 5 companies convicted since a law was passed here in 2000. Some 30-odd investigations. The OECD Working Group on Bribery is concerned by the lackluster response of the authorities in actual or alleged cases of foreign bribery involving French companies. Frederick Davis, they are saying it's because of the way the French system is. Do you think it's because of the way the law is written, or do you think it's just the French attitude, you that knows both former French and former British colonies in sub-Saharan Africa?
I think there's a lot to do with political will, which you see certainly in the States, and to a lesser extent, but it's quite strong, it's growing in power in Britain, a real repulsion and determination to deal with corruption, domestic corruption and foreign corruption, because there's a lot of domestic corruption in Britain and the States as well in terms of local contracts there, let alone before we even get overseas. And I think there's an infrastructure here. I don't think that infrastructure of civil society activists is anything like as strong in France. You're beginning to see it with the sort of Bien Malaki campaign here about the stolen assets by sort of dictators around the world buying beautiful Maison Particulière in Paris and so on. But it's much behind what you find in London and New York and Washington, I think, in terms of social attitudes.
Right,
so I think political will just isn't there.
But we'll see whether or not those attitudes here in France are changing. I'll be interested to hear what you have to say on this. When we return, you're watching the France 24 debate.